Okay, so as mentioned by Angela, we will be talking about social inequalities in health and aging, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about the intersection between social factor and environmental factors in shaping aging trajectories. And then I'll move the floor. I'll leave the floor to Shelby, who's just did a study on the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. And she will describe a little bit our results so far on this topic. So to move, we can go to the next one. Yeah, we can. We wanted to start this presentation with just testing a little bit of knowledge around social inequalities in health, but also potential mechanisms explaining them. So we can, Donald, move to the poll.
So that's the end of the first poll. Do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, okay. So most of you actually, yeah, the question was around which are the major risk factors for accelerated aging. And of course, this is something we'll discuss later, and it's a little bit of a combination of several risk factors, including smoking, socioeconomic disadvantage, and then exposures to environmental hazards, and also, of course, physical inactivity, other lifestyle-related risk factors, and workplace-related factors. But what we're going to be discussing a little bit more in depth is the intersection between these factors. And then the second question was around, can we go to the second? Yeah. The second question is around what you think is going to be the factor which is least likely to explain social differences in aging. And there is a social patterning of health behaviors, random biological variation, inequalities in access to resources, and cumulative exposure to stress. And I think, yeah, most of you, got that. Yeah, there is a little part that is potentially due to biological variation, but it's going to be very limited in relation to social differences in health, while inequalities in access to resources, the social patterning of health behaviors, cumulative exposure to stress, which could be environmental stress or psychosocial stress or material stress, are very important contributors. We can move to, we wanted to start this. You can move to the next slide. We wanted to start by having a little bit of, and you can move a little bit, sorry, Donald, because there is again, sorry, and again. Yeah, so we wanted to have a little bit of overview of social inequalities in aging and by socioeconomic conditions. And these are the first is one of the major studies conducted on the Whitehall study, which is a cohort that was developed in the 80s in the UK, and it has been one of the first studies to really show the sort of like socioeconomic gradient in health. In this graph, we are looking at mortality gradients. And as we can see here, we have four occupational position groups. The high in purple, which are the administrators. Then we go to intermediate, low, and the other category used to include people who were not classifiable in the civil service occupational grill. And it was included people like cleaners and this type of jobs. So this graph shows us the relative risk of death by occupational position in the civil service in the UK. And we can observe here the incredibly evident socioeconomic gradient with increasing mortality risk with decreasing occupational position. And as you can see here, for some, of course, all of these are some of these are very evidently related to the social patterning of smoking. But as we can see here, for example, in the chronic bronchitis, we have there was actually virtually no death in the high group and an incredible relative risk for those with the low occupational position. This was one of the first studies that started showing with a little bit of consistency the socioeconomic gradient in health outcomes. And then in a few years ago, actually now almost 10 years ago, we conducted a study grouping data on 46 cohorts around the world, and we try to look again with a comparative lens at the risk of premature mortality, comparing low versus high occupational positions. And in this graph, I know you cannot really see all the letters, but it's a list of cohorts from all over the world, comprising about 2 million people. And we show that overall, in this meta-analytic approach, there was a 40% increased risk of premature mortality, meaning before the age of 75, in the lowest versus highest occupational groups. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. And that the previous graphs refer to mortality, while in some other studies we looked at functional aging outcomes. And this one is a study again that we conducted a few years ago, and again grouping 37 cohorts from several continents. And in this time, we are looking at the impact of socioeconomic conditions on physical functioning as measured here by walking speed. And what we did in this study was to compare the effect of socioeconomic condition to that of several risk factors that are generally targeted by global health policies. And so here we use the same strategy and compare several factors, in this case, socioeconomic conditions, obesity, smoking, high alcohol intake, hypertension, diabetes, and physical inactivity. And what we were able to show here is that, for example, if we look at the socioeconomic condition part, men age 60 with a low socioeconomic condition had the same walking speed of those age 66 with a high socioeconomic condition. So a difference of around 6.6 years in functioning between the lowest and the highest socioeconomic condition. And this difference was comparable to that that was due to other common risk factors. If you can see the bottom line, this difference was around 6 years for physical inactivity, and then down to 3 years for walking speed here for what concerns smoking. We can move to the next. More recently, we have been working again on the comparison of functional aging outcomes between different cohorts, this time looking at trajectories. And in this study, we compared two longitudinal study on aging, a Canadian one and the British one, which was the one that actually initiated the other longitudinal study on aging. So you can see on the right-hand side the English longitudinal study on aging results, and on the left-hand side the Canadian longitudinal study on aging. And in this study, we look at the association between wealth as a measure of socioeconomic position and trajectories of aging. In this case, we are only presenting here the instrumental activities of daily living, which are a measure of how people are still able to do very important activities such as bathing, preparing meals, or being able to follow their budget. And every line that you see is a trajectory for a wealth group. And what we observed here, and then it's the time frame is age. So what we can see here is that with aging, of course, difficulties in completing activities of daily living are increasing. But we also observe sort of like, if you look at the Canadian data, a diverging trajectories with people with lower wealth acquiring difficulties earlier, and then those with a high socioeconomic conditions and high wealth. And in contrast, we saw, a similar pattern of increasing wealth inequalities in the English longitudinal study of aging, but it was also interesting to see these huge variations in sort of like instrumental activities of daily living between the two countries that we can see here in these two graphs. We can move to the next. Okay, so now moving to what explains these inequalities in health or aging, and we have here the determinants of health graph that I'm sure you all are familiar with, and we know that health is influenced by several layers of factors, going from distal factors such as the global ecosystem, the built environment and natural environment that you may all been studying or working on, and then going more proximal to lifestyle factors, community factors, to individual level factors. So the determinants of what explains social inequalities in health and aging probably has to be found within the determinants of health. And in the literature, these mechanisms explaining social differences in health have been generally classified into four boxes. From access and use to healthcare, to behavioral exposures such as smoking, diet, and physical activity, to psychosocial exposure that I know also are studied in your group, like going from social relationships and support to exposures in the workplace. And then finally, environmental exposures such as pollution, toxics, neighborhood factors, or living and working conditions. All of these factors, to have an impact on health, have to be sort of like biologically embedded. So in the group, we also study the trajectories from social exposure to intermediate factors, and then how these are incorporated to produce differences in health. To the next. So going back to the topic of this presentation, that was about the intersection between socioeconomic conditions and environmental exposures, just a little bit of introduction around what is known in the literature. These are two examples of social patterning of environmental exposure. In the left-hand side, an example from Norway with the concentration of PM2.5 at place of residence by neighborhood characteristics, where we see that in the four panels, we have progressively worse neighborhood level socioeconomic characteristics, with increasing, for example, proportion of manual class citizens, increasing proportion of people with below median income in the panel B. And as we see in all of the four panels, the more disadvantaged the neighborhoods, the higher the concentration of PM2.5. And in the Swedish studies, they looked at the concentration of NO2 in children by income level, and here again they were able to show that in the neighborhood with low income there was a higher concentration, and that was also the case for the schools. We can move to the next. This is a more recent study from the city of Vancouver that you may be aware about, and it looked at the tree canopy coverage in the different Vancouver neighborhoods. And as we can see here, a very clear difference in tree canopy coverage. And they show that there was there was a 14% difference between the highest and the lowest income neighborhood. And as you all know, only 1% increase corresponds to 23,000 trees. So there was really there are really large differences in the city we live in. And then finally, next slide, please. This is another even more recent study looking at the association between education, socioeconomic conditions, and access to walkable and green spaces. And here again, the authors were able to show that lower education, income, and occupation were consistently associated with less walkable and greener and green spaces. Next. So because of the, so this is another study where, sorry, going back to the social patterning of environmental exposures, I only presented a few studies that have looked at that. And what is much rarer is the number of studies that have actually been looking at the role of environmental exposure as a mechanisms explaining social differences in health. We can discuss maybe later why it is the case. It's probably due to the difficulty that you are all aware about of measuring these environmental exposures in this the context of these cohorts. But we identified a few studies in a recent review that Shelby has published, and here are two examples of studies that have actually looked empirically in a data set of how much the social patterning of environmental exposures is able to explain the social differences that we see in health outcomes. In Czechia, the authors were able to show that there was a link between education and lung function, and then around 12% of this association was explained by exposure to air pollution. While, for example, in this other US study, they looked at the role of tree canopy exposure in the link between education and hypertension, and they did not find a mediating effect. So from our own review of the literature, there is really very limited data available on the actual contribution of environmental exposures to the social inequalities in health. And also the few studies that exist are quite inconsistent in the type of results that they give. That's why we actually decided to look at that more closely in the data that we have here in Canada. So next slide. So yeah, and yeah, next again. Sorry, next. This was around what I just said. Yeah, so because of that, we decided to look at it again, and Shelby will present you our own results from the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. Thank you, Shelby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Silvia. So based on the existing evidence that Silvia's presented in, there's much more, but for the context of time, that was kind of a really good snippet of what's going on. It's also showing us that there are a lot of remaining gaps in the literature. And so to further explore this, we wanted to kind of look at this research question within a Canadian context. So we leveraged data from the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, also known as CLSA. This is a nationally representative cohort of Canadians aged 45 to 85 years old at the time of recruitment. They were randomly selected within age and sex strata, and they're all residing within 25 to 50 kilometers of one of the 11 data collection sites, and these are all spread across 7. For the purpose of our study, we've used 3 waves of this data, so it ranges from baseline through follow-up 2. And in order to gain insight on the environmental exposures or the information related to their environmental exposure, our CLSA data has been linked to CANU, which is the Canadian Urban Environmental Health Research Consortium, which you might have be very familiar with, as is a very common environmental data set in Canada. Next slide, please. All right, so moving into the analysis that we were really trying to conduct. By leveraging the data, we were aiming to investigate the complex interplay between socioeconomic conditions and a wide range of environmental exposures and how these might be influencing functional aging. So for the context of this study, we were really focusing on functional aging outcomes. However, there are tons of ways that we can evaluate aging, as Silvia mentioned, through mortality research, longevity and trajectories, and epigenetic aging, and so on. But for this context, we're really focusing on the functional outcomes. I don't have time to go through all of the additional steps that we did to choose these variables because we had so much variables and data to choose from. But I will say that lots of sensitivity analysis, and we consulted the literature in depth in choosing these variables, sorry. So to start as our indicator for socioeconomic conditions, we looked at household income, which is a 5-level categorical variable. It ranges from as low as those who reported earning less than $20,000 annually within their household income, and as high as earning over $150,000 as their household income. For the purpose of our study and our research question, we wanted to use the highest income level as our reference group. And then moving into our functional outcomes, again, we had many to choose from, but we decided on walking speed, which is a 4-meter walk test that's timed in seconds. So you will see throughout the presentation that higher values of walking speed is actually a negative thing because it's taking them longer to walk the 4-meter distance. Lung function is FEV1, and it's measured in liters. We have grip strength that was measured in kilograms with their dominant hand across 3 trials. And then, as Silvia kind of briefly mentioned, ADL and IADL, which are difficulties with activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. And these are scores that range from 0 to 7, and they're including variable, or the participants are asked questions like if they have difficulty using the washroom, changing, making meals, grocery shopping, navigation, managing their money, and so on. In terms of our hypothesized mediators for this analysis were environmental exposures. So for air pollution, we used the 1-year annual means of NO2 and PM2.5, sorry. We used greenness and tree canopy cover, both with buffer sizes of 500 meters, and household exposures, which were measured by asking individuals, do you have any of the current, does your current home have any of the following problems? And then they ranged from mold and condensation, leaking, maintenance and repairs, electrical and plumbing. And again, this was subbed into a score. All of our functional outcomes and environmental exposure mediators were all numeric as variables. In terms of covariates, there were many to choose from, as I mentioned. There were some that were considered like health behaviors and other health-related variables like self-rated health or chronic conditions. But due to concerns that they may lie on the causal path, we do believe that these need to be further explored in separate mediation analysis. So for the covariates that were chosen for this analysis, we've chosen age, sex, race, the number of members living in the household. This is to account for household income, region, and then height for walking speed and walking speed and grip strength. And this is supported within the literature. Next slide, please. So for our preliminary steps, considering we were using longitudinal data, it was really important to handle missingness very, robustly. So we used multiple imputation by chained equations, which generated 20 imputed data sets. We also needed to test for interaction. We tested multiple variables, but some to note were sex, race, and region. However, we did only see evidence for sex, and our sample size did allow us to have sex stratified analyses, which was great. Again, many assumptions for mediation analysis must be addressed, but one in particular to mention is ensuring that there's no interaction between our exposure and our mediator. So in our case, between household income and the environmental exposures. We tested this and we were able to move forward with the mediation, which was great. And then the last kind of step for the preliminary analysis is to run regression models that are going to assess all the associations between functional outcomes, in household income, and environmental exposures, just to kind of see what's going on between these 3 variables. Next slide, please. All right, so then we moved into the bulk of the analysis, and we used counterfactual mediation with the aim of estimating the natural, direct, and indirect effects of household income on functional outcomes through environmental exposures. So looking at the DAG, we can see that we had household income at baseline, our covariates at baseline, environmental exposures measured at baseline, and then our functional outcomes measured at 3 time points. And the reason for having the exposure medians and covariates measured at baseline was to allow us to meet the assumption that confounders of the mediator outcome relationship were not affected by the exposure. For our mediation analysis, we did run it for each of the environmental exposures and each of the outcomes to be able to get all of the results that we were looking for, and our analysis were stratified by sex. Next slide, please. So using all of the 28,158 participants who had complete household income data at baseline, we found that participants were 50% female, 95%, sorry, just back one more. Thank you. 95% white. The mean age was 63. 28% of the sample reported a baseline household income below 50,000. And we found that over 90% resided in the urban core areas. Now, this is quite what we expected, considering they did recruit within 25 to 50 kilometers of the data collection sites, which were within the city. So that is something that we had to account for. Next slide, please. So looking at this mediation kind of brief little DAG here, first I'll be talking about some results that we found when looking at the association with household income and functional outcomes. So our exposure outcome association. Next slide, please. So in these figures here, we can see the trajectories of these outcomes across age. So we have walking speed and lung function. It's quite small, but the age is on the x-axis, and then the outcomes are on the y. And then the different colors represent each of the income groups. So as we can see, we have a gradient between the different different household income groups and the rate of decline. And we can see, just in case, we have the orange, that's the lowest income, and red at the bottom, that's the highest income. Next slide, please. And then again, for these outcomes, we saw similar results for grip strength and IADL, but it is notable to see that we do see a social disparity in the rate of decline for IADL, where the middle and lower income groups, so from, I guess you could say, green through orange, we're seeing at the tail end, it really diverts and starts to, their level of difficulty increases quicker than the more wealthy two groups. Next slide, please. Moving into the exposure mediator association, so household income and environmental exposures. Next slide, please. So here we have the results of the association between household income and environmental exposures. For the premise of the presentation, I've just presented lowest versus highest income, but we did explore all the categories to really get a great overview. And we did see a dose response relationship between each income group and the level of exposure to air pollution, greenness, and tree canopy cover and household exposures. Overall, we saw that lower household income was linked to increased air pollution exposure, more difficulties with their current home, less greenness, and tree canopy cover within 500 meters. Next slide, please. And then the last preliminary association to look at was between environmental exposures and functional outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is a very large table, and I wouldn't look at it too long because you might get a little overwhelmed. But in general, when we're looking at the environmental exposures and how they're showing with functional outcomes, we're seeing that air pollution and household exposures are showing an adverse effect. So they're showing slower walking times, weaker grip strengths, poorer lung function, and more difficulties with ADL and IADL. Whereas greenness and tree canopy cover, we're seeing protective effects. So we're seeing faster walking speeds, stronger grip strengths, better lung function, and less difficulties with ADL and IADL consistently. Next slide, please. So now going into the results of the mediation analysis, here we have two forest plots. So on the left, there's for males, and on the right is for females. These graphs in particular are for standardized effects of household income on walking speed. This is just walking speed. We'll move through the other ones. In red, we see the total effect, which is going to be the combined effect or the total pathway between household income and functional outcome. In blue, we see the direct effect, which is how much of the total effect does not go through the mediator. So how much of the effect is independent of the mediation that we're testing. And then the green is actually asking how much of the total effect is going through the mediator. So for walking speed in particular, we're seeing positive total total and direct effects, where we're seeing that low household income is associated with slower walking speed, which is consistent with the preliminary analysis results. And we are seeing that the effects are a little bit larger among female participants than male. And out of the proportion mediates, they're all quite small. However, I would say the most notable is the effect of tree canopy cover. So we're seeing that 3.4% of the association between household income and walking speed is mediated by whether they have tree canopy cover within 500 meters, and that's in male participants. Next slide, please. So this next slide has our standardized effects of household income on grip strength. And in this case, we're seeing negative negative total and direct effects, because we're seeing that low income is associated with weaker grip strength. So we're seeing the opposite, as we kind of expected. It is quite something to consider that for males, the largest proportion mediated observed was for household exposures with a proportion of 4.6%. And for females, the largest observed was tree canopy cover, with 5.2% of the association being explained by tree canopy cover. Again, for both these outcomes, we're not seeing any strong or significant mediating effects from pollution. Moving on to next slide, please. In terms of lung function, total and direct effects were also consistent with our preliminary analysis, where we're seeing low household income is associated with poorer lung function. But as for the mediators, the indirect effects and proportion mediated, were very small. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this is ADL. I'll move into IADL next, but overall, we're seeing similar trends with these two outcomes. Household exposures were the most notable mediators observed. So we're seeing that 8% and 9.8% of the association between low income and whether they have difficulties with their activities of daily living can be explained with them having difficulties in their current home. So like I said, going back, that can include maintenance and repairs, electrical and plumbing, leaking, mold and condensation. And while it's not reflected in the proportion mediated, I think it's still notable to show the differences in the total effect and the direct effect that we're seeing with tree canopy cover. So we are seeing on the right for females in particular, you can see it for males as well, but it is a little bit larger in females, which is showing us that there is something going on. Next slide, please. And again, like I said, very similar to ADL, IADL is also showing mediating effects from household exposures, which is very consistent with the literature. And we did find that the mediating effects were slightly smaller among men here. So we do see mediating effects of around 3% for males, which is very different from females, which we're seeing around 7 to 8%. Next slide, please. So as some conclusions, we see that air pollution showed only weak or non-significant mediating effects across outcomes. Now, this is kind of what we expected in terms of the literature being quite mixed with air pollution. And we are seeing that air pollution, in terms of the income to aging kind of association is really context dependent and dependent on the environment where the studies are taking place. For example, we're seeing that a Canadian study found higher NO2 exposure in lower income households in Toronto and Vancouver, but higher exposure in Montreal. And then we've seen similar findings in other countries like US and South Korea. US, for example, which would have similar pollution exposure to some Canadian cities. In terms of household exposures, we're seeing that there may be a small but significant portion of the effect of household income on the number of difficulties with the activities of daily living that could be explained by household exposures. This is aligned with the literature because we're seeing that those with lower income are often associated with poorer housing quality. We're seeing more likely to be exposed to mold and condensation, which was an example of one of the questions that the participants were asked. And we're also seeing in the literature that household conditions, including household quality, can have direct and indirect effects and may compromise the performance of daily tasks, which again is related to what we found. And then lastly, for greenness and tree canopy cover within 500 meters, we are seeing that protective effect, and we're seeing that there is, it is associated with faster walking times and just overall greater functional health. And I think there's two kind of things to consider here is one, that when we look at a study like Silvia mentioned with the tree canopy cover across Vancouver, this is kind of aligned with what we're seeing. We are seeing that the distribution is based on social disparity, and we're also seeing how that links to functional aging as well. And then second, it's also important to also, like I mentioned, consider that these distributions or these patterns of greenness and tree canopy cover within 500 meters of the home may also be associated with their aging. Next slide, please.
All right, thanks a lot, Shelby. So I just really wanted to move from the conclusion of the studies a little bit to the conclusions, and then presenting you a little bit of what we are thinking about doing in the lab, still on this theme of interplay between socioeconomic conditions and environmental exposures. I have to say we are encountering a little bit of the major difficulties around environmental health that we would be very happy to discuss with you at another time or later in the questions, because we have in all of these cohorts a great assessment for many of the exposures around socioeconomic conditions and the outcomes, while most of the times we have to limit the actual assessment of the actual environmental exposure to a limited amount of time. Or, for example, with this mediation modeling, we were not able to consider all of the environmental exposures at the same time because of limitations in the methodology. And then, of course, even if we had to measure and be able to measure over time with time varying sort of constructs, we don't have the data for all that happened before participants were enrolled here. And while for some of the exposures it may be easier to assume, like imagine how simple it is to assess whether someone has been smoking and since when, as you all are aware, for what concerns exposure to environmental factors, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we are faced to the limitation many of you will have. So partially this can explain why we see a little like a small mediated proportion, but still we'll keep working on it and trying to also we are starting working with methodologists around the mediation to see what they have applied and what can be done in terms of trying to be more precise on that measurements. And the next chapter of this study that we have shown here with the CLSA will be to extend the analysis of social differences in aging outcomes to several cohorts, and in that you can see here in the graph. And then we'll also for all of these cohorts, we also have environmental exposure. So we just were funded last week to be looking at this, the contribution of environmental factors in social differences in aging trajectories with this comparative approach. Next, please. Within the CLSA, one of the master students in the lab is also looking at a similar topic, but she is looking at biological age as measured as epigenetic clocks. So same concept of looking at the association between socioeconomic conditions and biological age, but then how much of the biological age differences are explained by variation in exposure to environmental factors. So Amanda has a master thesis on this. Next slide, please. We have also been collaborating with the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research and the University of Geneva with a little funding we have received, and we have just analyzed in a subsample of children of the Vereecke kids cohort. We actually conducted measurements in the biobank of this study, and were able to measure heavy metal exposure with some incredible results that we didn't expect. Several children seem to have levels of contamination of lead and mercury that are higher to what is recommended by the WHO. So we are also trying to navigate these parts, and then we will also measure and then link socioeconomic conditions of this population to air pollution and other environmental exposures as measured at the neighborhood level. And next slide. And finally, we have submitted an application to the Jacobs Foundation to be hosting here at UBC one of the Levante sites. Levante is a program of the Jacobs Foundation to be looking around the world at learning outcomes in children. And in the project we have submitted, and we are at the last stage, so we are really hoping, and we'll see. We propose to complement the BC wildfire study that I can talk to a little bit more if you're interested. But we propose to actually have some little funds to go and measure again environmental exposures in urine and blood samples to be able to actually complement the data that is obtained at the administrative level in the BC wildfire study, and look at the impact of these environmental exposures into social differences in learning outcomes. And with that, we are really open to answer all of your questions, and we wanted to thank the other members of the lab, our collaborators, and of course the funders. Thanks a lot to everyone for listening to this.